I'm astounded at the number of taxi drivers in Taiwan who know all about politics in Taiwan. If you ask the taxi driver in the US or an Uber driver, they probably couldn't name who the governor of California is.
Welcome to the US-Taiwan Watch special interview, and I'm Jasmine Kexing.
This is Fang Yu.
And today we have a very special guest from Stanford University, Kharis Templeman. Kharis, can you say hi to our audience?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me.
It's our pleasure. So we have a lot of tough questions today.
Great.
But at the beginning, let me start with the warm-up question. So if our audience is watching right now, you can just type Kharis Templeman on Google and you will see Kharis' website. And at the cover photo of Kharis' website, it's a sculpture from a very renowned sculptor in Taiwan, Zhu Ming. Mm-hmm. And we're just very curious, why you picked the photo, and did you take the photo yourself?
Yeah, many years ago.
And
yeah.
what's the story behind it too?
Yeah, so a couple things. Juming Meishuguan, for those who don't know, is an outdoor museum that is in northern Taiwan. It's got a bunch of outdoor sculptures from Juming, and it's one of my favorite places in Taiwan. It's a beautiful area. It's you can look out over the ocean. You've got Yangmingshan behind you.
Yes.
I liked that photo in particular for my blog because I thought it captured something essential about Taiwan and Taiwan politics.
How is that?
Well, you'll notice there's a blue sky, green grass below, and then there's the Tai Chi guy in the middle. And I thought, blue and green, that's Taiwan, right? And so it's a very subtle kind of nod to Taiwan's political camps as well.
Are you going to pay a visit to there this trip?
I'm probably not on this trip, but I'd like to get there sometime this year. I'll be back in August and then in the winter for the election.
So here's the question. So I just met you a few months ago from the last time you came to Taiwan. And I was so shocked that you came to Taiwan again, like after a few months.
Why am I here? Can't stay away.
And can you tell us more about your trip here?
Sure. So this trip, I'm part of a group known as the U.S.-Taiwan Next Gen Working Group, which is run out of Berkeley, UC Berkeley. And the goal of that organization is to train the next generation of Taiwan experts in the United States. So we started that program at the beginning of COVID in 2020.
Oh, no.
And we were supposed to make a trip to Taiwan then. We couldn't because the doors were closed because of health issues. And so we finally are able to come now at the end of our program. We've got a second cohort that's come in now. So we're coming together. We've got a big group of about 20 who will be here for a week. And we'll make the rounds of government, political parties, NGOs, and some other organizations.
Regarding the visit to Taiwan, and recently there are so many groups coming to Taiwan. We'll talk about this later. And can you share more about your role in Hoover?
Sure. So I manage a program on Taiwan and Taiwan politics and security issues. And part of my role has evolved to be kind of to facilitate being a gateway to Stanford. In recent years, as interest in Taiwan has grown, there's a lot more demand to visit Taiwan. So I try to help as well set people up with interviews here or meetings here.
How long have you been there?
So I joined Stanford just about 10 years ago, but I'm much newer to the Hoover Institution. This program moved over to Hoover in fall of 2020, and so I've been there since.
Before we have this interview, we mentioned about the China study and Taiwan study.
Taiwan studies. So Taiwan studies has always sat rather awkwardly within broader China studies. And it's for obvious reasons. People who think that Taiwan is part of China think Taiwan belongs in the China studies field. People who think Taiwan is a separate thing would prefer to have it broken apart and be something like Korea studies or Japanese studies. So you'll see this, for instance, in the Association for Asian Studies, the main regional scholarly association. There's a section for Korea studies and a section for Japan studies and a section for China studies, but no Taiwan studies section. So that's one example of a larger kind of tension within the Taiwan studies field, which is, do we see ourselves as part of the greater field of China scholars? And there are some reasons why we might. The language is the same. Many of the questions we ask are similar. Taiwan had a Leninist political party like the CCP. The KMT was, the single ruling party here for many years. Cultural questions, traditional Chinese music or art, those kinds of topics cross that boundary very easily. But then things in the political realm, especially more recently as Taiwan has democratized and consolidated its democracy, those, to my mind, don't fit naturally at all in the study of the PRC, at least, as the representative of China. I'm much more comfortable comparing Taiwan to Japan or Korea or other third-wave democracies in, say, Eastern Europe, like Poland or Hungary. But the drawback to breaking Taiwan away from China studies is that Taiwan by itself then looks kind of small, right, and isolated.
We also have to consider the number of scholars who are doing this kind of studies, and also the resources and how many courses we can offer or something like that.
Yeah, right. So if you look around American academia, there are often jobs in departments that are dedicated, there's a line dedicated to a China scholar. There would almost never be a position dedicated solely to a Taiwan scholar or a Taiwan expert. Mm-hmm. And so if you want somebody who knows about Taiwan to get that position, they need to be able to convince the hiring committee that they can teach courses on China and do research on China. Yeah.
But now the atmosphere is changing.
It is. So one part of that is an increase in interest in Taiwan in the U.S. Another part of that is the rising competition between the United States and the PRC. A third is the concern about Taiwan's own security, its economy, and a kind of belated recognition that Taiwan is actually quite important economically to the United States. And then finally, I want to commend the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the broader Taiwan government for funding programs on Taiwan in the U.S. My own program is funded primarily by a grant from MOFA, but they've dramatically expanded and also changed their funding model a little bit. So they're endowing positions at universities. So they are creating that position that will go to someone who has Taiwan expertise. And that's funding and a line set aside for that sort of person. And that is helping institutionalize Taiwan studies programs in the U.S. that will then provide long-term benefit for Taiwan studies.
Well, I have to add something here because, in the internet, many people will say that blame the government that, okay, you cannot do this. You are funding, creating so-called 侧翼 and to buy the support. I would say that it is very common, especially from Japanese government and also the Korean government. They are doing the same thing. So it is not buying someone to do you a favor. It's not. It's an institutionalized studies in the academia. So it's very common.
Right. And your mention of Korea reminded me that Korean studies in the United States has boomed over the last 20 years. I was astounded when I went to AAS at the number of Korea scholars in Korean panels. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that is that the Korea Foundation, starting 25 years ago, went around and endowed positions and provided funding not only for centers, but for graduate students to do field work in Korea, for scholars who wanted to do a conference or a book project, and provided a set of funding all the way from the time someone entered graduate school all the way to senior faculty. That foundation dramatically increased the number of resources and the impact that Korea had in the U.S. academia.
The Korean Foundation is sponsored by the Korean government?
Partly by the government, yeah.
Okay.
But also partly by private
sectors.
The private sector, yeah. Korea has big chaebols, the giant conglomerates, and several of those have contributed a lot of money to the Korea Foundation. And so if you wanted to build on this progress in Taiwan studies, I think the Korea model is a good one, actually. And if you could attract some private funding to match some of the public, that would deepen the kind of commitment that you can make to Taiwan studies in the U.S.
Yeah, that's kind of the soft power, right?
Very much, yeah. And let's be very explicit about how this soft power works, right? The course that I teach on Taiwan, I try to encourage students to think about going to Taiwan as well. And in some cases, they are already here. They've arrived for the summer. They're doing internships or language study, and that cultivates then a lifelong connection to the place. And those may not go on to be Taiwan experts, but Stanford undergrads are smart and they're headed for great things, right?
This time, Kharis, your visit to Taiwan is also a project to cultivate Taiwan's experts.
So this working group, the U.S.-Taiwan Next Generation Working Group, is intended to fill what I see as a gap in Taiwan expertise in the U.S. So there's a senior generation of scholars in the U.S. who may have focused on China mostly in their research, but had a strong connection to Taiwan because they had to come here to do their language study, if nothing else. And that generation is mostly retired now, and they've been replaced on university faculties in the China slots and all these departments with people who just went straight to the PRC for their language study and maybe have never set foot in Taiwan and don't have any kind of strong connection to the place. There used to be a much deeper Taiwan bench. And then in the 2000s to 2010s, people were discouraged from focusing on Taiwan because China was booming. China was the place to go, right? And so people who took the time and really dedicated themselves to learning the Chinese language saw China as a much better payoff for that investment, right? Now I think the pendulum is swinging back. Taiwan is, on the cover of a news magazine, calling it the most dangerous place on earth, or
the most important as well.
Yes, most important, right? or talking about TSMC, for instance, as a critical company. So there is some rising interest now in Taiwan, and people who are investing in learning Chinese are, for a variety of reasons, actually coming to Taiwan again to study it.
I'm just curious. So there is a gap. For the senior researcher and the experts, they have more knowledge onto Taiwan. And at the middle generation, probably more focus on China. And young generation, more interest in Taiwan. So the senior generations and the young generation, they can talk to each other with traditional Chinese.
Well, sure. Some of my seniors in this field can remember learning traditional Chinese characters in the 1960s or 70s, right? At Donghai Daxue down in Taichung, say, or at Taida or Shida in Taipei. So they had that traditional character base before they started studying China. For me, I went the other way, actually. I learned Jiantizi first when I was in college, and then went to mainland China, studied Jiantizi there, and then came to Taiwan and had to start again, right?
I think the written season is the most difficult part.
Yes, it's like drawing.
Yes, right. But I will say, characters didn't really make sense to me until I got to Taiwan and I had to learn the traditional forms, because in the way they're put together,
there's a logic behind it.
There is a logic behind them, and I had no kind of intuition for that until I learned the traditional forms, and then I found it was easier to memorize and easier to read traditional. So I'm biased, but I like traditional.
I like the example that in the simplified Chinese love, there's no heart
for
love.
Took it out.
That's an example.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a really good example. Yeah. So I think let's move on to the tough questions.
Sure.
So the first tough question I want to ask is actually mentioned several times in our podcast. So we're talking about dialogues between U.S. and China and how important it is for the two biggest economy in the world, also two countries with nuclear weapon, to have a dialogue. In the past few months, we've seen that U.S. has expressed its willingness to have a dialogue with China. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, he would request a dialogue with the Chinese Defense Minister Li Shangfu to have a dialogue at the Shangri-La Dialogue. And also Blinken, Secretary of State, wanted to reschedule another meeting with China after the previous one was canceled due to the spy balloon.
The balloon.
Yeah, the balloon. But every time China give U.S. the cold shoulder. And we're just wondering, what is China? What do they want it to do?
Right. So demand for dialogue on the U.S. side, or the request for dialogue, hasn't generally been reciprocated from the Chinese side, in part because we have different visions, I think different understandings of what dialogues exist to do. On the Chinese side, they're part of the larger set of bargaining issues, right? If you really want a dialogue, we're going to use that as a chip to trade with you for something else. And so you need to make a concession in some other part of the bargaining space in order for us to show up with our top person in the room and give you face and so forth. On the U.S. side, the mentality is that normal countries with a good relationship talk all the time and should be able to talk regularly about all of the things that trouble our relationship. And so when the other side is not doing that and refuses to do that, we get really anxious, really nervous, frustrated. And so I don't oppose attempts to engage in dialogue between the two sides, but I think we do need to understand on the U.S. side what the Chinese motives for this are. They're trying to extract some other concessions from the United States.
My sense is that I read some of the articles from the US media. They tend to be critical of these attitudes. I mean, they are asking why does the government want to schedule this kind of conversation. Am I correct?
Well, I mean, the U.S. media is a big, diverse group, and so some voices are critical, but many other voices, if you read, say, the opinion pages in the New York Times or Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, there are also voices there calling two sides to talk to each other. We've got to get out of this conflict we're headed towards. And the thinking there seems to be that if the two sides could just talk, they could work out their differences, and then we'd step out of this confrontation, and shake hands and come back to a normal kind of relationship. And I think that's a fundamental misunderstanding of where the challenge lies in the bilateral relationship. We really fundamentally have different interests on a lot of issues, and both sides may find it advantageous to enter into a compromise and to give a little bit on some issues and get something on others, but those conflicts of interest are not going to go away simply by stepping into a room together and talking. So I tend to lean towards the side that views these dialogues as, certainly we shouldn't treat them like something that's worth trading a lot away for. However, I do have a second thought on this, which is the way that hot conflicts wars start, typically is because of misperception about your adversary. To my mind, the most dangerous thing for Taiwan right now is that Xi Jinping himself or the people around him misperceive the U.S. commitment to Taiwan, trends in Taiwan, Taiwan's own willingness to defend itself. There is some real worry. I think there are some justified concerns that Xi Jinping himself may not be getting full information about some of these issues. And so if there are any channels by which the U.S. can communicate credibly what we see in Taiwan, what we are doing in Taiwan, what we see from the Chinese, our own views of that provides them a more accurate picture of the situation. And if there are ways to communicate that directly to Xi Jinping, do them. So don't sign up for every opportunity and give away the house to go have a meeting with Wang Yi or someone. But if there are ways to develop a variety of channels and to communicate both privately and publicly, if you're not making massive concessions, that should be your default. I think we should seek that. So I don't have a huge problem with what the Biden administration is doing right now. I don't see them fundamentally giving away anything to have these meetings.
I also want to add that in 2021, Antony Blinken, he had a meeting with the CCP Foreign Affairs Chief, Wang Jiechi, and that meeting in Alaska was pretty furious.
Hostile, I could say. Right.
And in international relations theory, and also you mentioned about a lot of opinion pieces on the New York Times. And I kind of understand because that's how I was educated when I was studying international relations. We always emphasize that how important is a dialogue to contain risk and to contain the tension. But the dialogue, as just mentioned, in Alaska in 2021 doesn't seem to help contain a risk.
I think So the United States has some fundamental concerns about the relationship.
Yes.
We have interests, and the PRC does too. I actually think both sides are pretty clear about what the other side's fundamental interests are, and the bigger question is whether there's any room for compromise or for some kind of collaboration on issues. And so I would go into any sort of dialogue with low expectations, but
And the Chinese side just shouting every time.
yeah. So another part of what was so unproductive about that meeting in Alaska was that it was public and it was very performative. And also it was the beginning, we should be fair, of a new administration in the U.S., and both sides were trying to set the ground rules or set the kind of an expectation for how that relationship was going to go forward. So neither side had an incentive to look weak or to make gestures of, and they were also playing to a domestic audience as well. So the whole setup of that conference, I think, was bound to produce something that was pretty unproductive.
Let's move on to the U.S.-China relations. We're saying that Biden administration in his past 3 years, and he has been moving the U.S. foreign policy more towards or going back to the multilateralism, and both in Europe and Asia. But if you compare Asia and Europe, in Asia there's no such a mechanism like NATO for members to coordinate policy or to resolve disputes between members. So my question is, what is U.S. vision in Asia, and what are the constraints for them to achieve it?
Yeah, so the U.S. presence in Asia, the security relationships of the United States in Asia are quite a bit different from the U.S. relationships in Europe. So NATO is a big multilateral organization with lots of member states, all of whom pledge to defend every other state if there's an attack on another one. In Asia, for complicated historical reasons, the U.S. has a set of bilateral relationships, and the level of security commitment in each of those relationships is a little bit different. So in the U.S.-Japan relationship, for instance, the U.S. is able to base troops in Japan, to operate out of Japan, to kind of project power into the Western Pacific from Japan, and has a good working relationship with the Japan Self-Defense Forces. But because of Article 9 in Japan, the self-defense forces are not supposed to be used for any kind of offensive operations. And that's been a traditional barrier to integrating the United States and Japan's militaries into a more coherent whole. I contrast that with, say, the Korean Peninsula, where there's actually a joint command set up. In wartime, at least, the U.S. commander has authority over both American and Korean troops, and there's a clear plan about how to do that. And so the U.S.-Korea relationship in the security space is probably the most integrated, the one that looks most like a potential NATO relationship.
But it's only between the U.S. and the
Yeah, it's still bilateral. It's not multilateral, but it does have a deep level of joint planning for training and operation. And so I contrast that again with Taiwan, where the U.S. has no formal diplomatic or security ties, and that relationship is much shallower and for diplomatic reasons has to be done informally. And so the U.S. maintains some connections to the Taiwan military, but we don't have a defense treaty. We're not under any obligation to come defend Taiwan. And the kind of level of operation that we would get to in the event of a conflict is actually quite uncertain. And that's, again, for political reasons.
I think that is part of the sources for the
U.S.
U.S.
skepticism.
Yes.
That's what I was thinking about.
Yeah, the 以美论, right?
Yes.
The U.S. skepticism of the United States in Taiwan, right? And yeah, that's fair. I think since 1979, the U.S. has, in our official policy at least, not recognized Taiwan as an independent state, has prioritized formal diplomatic relations with the PRC over the ROC on Taiwan. I would call it a policy of having our cake and eating it too. So we have formal relations with the PRC and gain some benefits from that, and both Democratic and Republican administrations have endorsed that approach. But we also have robust unofficial relations with Taiwan, and so we get benefits from that as well. And so from the U.S. perspective, the status quo is the best of all worlds. There's no way to move away from what we have now without either breaking off relations with Beijing or abandoning Taiwan completely.
But it's now improving, right? Because there are so many cooperation projects, especially more and more public, right? For example, on the military one.
Yes, yeah. We are in a very different place than we were 5 years ago. And I have to say, a lot of this is due to Tsai Ing-wen. I think President Tsai should deserve a lot of credit for the much deeper and much broader set of security initiatives that the U.S. and Taiwan are involved in today. The reason for that is the United States trusts her. She has done an excellent job of keeping her side of the bargain in these agreements to deepen cooperation. And part of what's difficult for a Taiwan leader is that they cannot talk about much of what is done. There are clear political incentives for a leader of Taiwan to talk about them publicly, right? You want to win the next election. You want to convince Taiwanese that you've gained something from this relationship with the United States. Well, the U.S. doesn't want you to talk about those things. And she has kept that promise, which has allowed this amount of cooperation to move forward.
But at the beginning, when Tsai Ing-wen got elected back in 2016,
Yes.
as I know, please correct me if I'm wrong, U.S. does not have that kind of trust to DPP because of Chen Shui-bian.
There was certainly some lingering distrust of the DPP, although Tsai, as party chairwoman and as the candidate, in the run-up to 2016, worked very hard to push back, to dispel some of that distrust. And by 2016, by the time she took office, I think there was a high level of comfort with her and her incoming administration in the United States. That level of comfort is bipartisan. Republicans and Democrats both admire Tsai, are supporters of her policies and her administration, and have generally found her to be a really responsible steward of American interests in the relationship.
Would you elaborate what kind of actions or what have she done before taking the office that makes U.S. really started to trust her?
So there's a real contrast between the 2012 and 2016 elections and what she said in 2012 and going up to 2016. So some of your audience may recall that she, as the candidate of the DPP in the 2012 campaign, visited the U.S., gave some talks in D.C., both publicly and privately, and it leaked out to the press that the United States government was uncomfortable with her pledges to maintain the status quo, that they didn't see her as fully committed to that vision. And so that, unfortunately, in my view, but that actually, made the news, was reported back in Taiwan widely, and I think really undercut her appeal in that campaign. To her credit, she learned a lot from that. She worked very hard to develop deeper relations with people in the U.S. and to revise her statements on cross-strait issues, and also to bring her party along. This was the other concern. It's not just about the party leader. Ultimately, the party leader is accountable to the grassroots membership. And so in the run-up to 2016, she had clearly firm control over the DPP's leadership. She was not beholden to, say, a deep green wing of the party, and didn't need to respond to demands to push towards independence in the way that some people feared she might have to in 2012. And her language in her campaign and in her inauguration speech, actually, I'd encourage people to go reread her inauguration speech. It's actually quite a step for a DPP leader to embrace the status quo, to embrace all of the cross-strait agreements that the Ma administration had struck. She said, we accept that those happened. We want to keep those. My government will not try to change the status quo. I embrace the Republic of China Constitution. Previous DPP leaders had always been uncomfortable, to say the least, with the fact that the country's name is officially Republic of China, not Taiwan. So if you go through all of the things she said in that speech, to an American audience looking at that, they say, she is saying exactly what we would say, or we would encourage any leader of Taiwan to say in that cross-strait relationship. The only audience that it didn't impact well was in Beijing. And Beijing had, I think, just massively unrealistic expectations for what she could or should do in that speech. As a consequence, Beijing decided, this famous incomplete test answer, right? She's a pupil of ours. She needs to pass the test in order for us to talk to her. And to tie back to something we said before, talking from Beijing's perspective is part of the game. You have to say the right words in order for us to open the doors and actually have a conversation. So they used the same playbook with Tsai Ing-wen that they've used in recent months with the Biden administration.
But many Taiwanese politicians are proud of that they can answer the Beijing test, right?
Yeah, I think ability to talk to CCP in Beijing is actually the KMT's strongest selling point in this coming election. And I wouldn't discount the appeal of that with the Taiwanese voters. You know, Tsai Ing-wen and the DPP, it doesn't matter who the DPP nominee is after Tsai Ing-wen. If Beijing wouldn't talk to Tsai, they're not going to talk to any DPP candidate. It doesn't matter what that candidate does. They don't trust the DPP, full stop. I think that's unfortunate. I think they missed an opportunity with Tsai. That is the way it is. And the KMT, whatever else you might say about the KMT and their cross-strait policy, they, I think, can make a credible case to the voters that if you elect a KMT president, Beijing will be friendlier to them than they will any DPP president. And so it's up to the Taiwan voters to decide how much that's worth.
I think KMT is now worrying about how Ko Wen-je is now appealing to this.
Yeah.
And because Ko Wen-je is trying to convince everyone that he is the most acceptable politician who can talk to the US and also China.
Let's circling back to the US-Taiwan instead of the Taiwan domestic politics. So in our podcast, we also mentioned a lot about the war games that both U.S. government and the think tanks has been doing in past years. And what is the signal you think they are trying to send to Taiwan?
Well, so war games get held for a variety of reasons. Not all of the ones that are held are made public. So a think tank like CSIS will do a war game, and they will, because of who they are and who they invite, they typically make those results public. But the U.S. military does war games all the time in all kinds of different scenarios, and you'll probably never hear about the results of those. So that's the first stage. There's a bunch of war games that have been screened out initially. And then the second thing about war games that can be misleading is they're not very interesting if the parties don't actually start the war, right? So they're set up to bring the parties into a conflict, and they really don't get interesting unless one side says, okay, go, fire, right? So it's actually pretty removed from the broader political and diplomatic question of whether the parties will go to war in the first place. And that broader question, that background question, is the critical one. And so war games will tell you a little bit, not always, about which side, if they decided to go to war, would win or would have a better chance of coming out ahead. But they don't tell you what the political calculations of the leader deciding to start that conflict have to be to push the button or to give the signal. And so I actually discount the results of a lot of war games, especially the ones that are made public, because they're intended to be provocative. They're intended to teach you what your weaknesses are and to help you understand how to mitigate those weaknesses, improve on them. And so war games...
It's not the prediction. Right?
Not at all. No, it's a learning device. And so when you see the result of a war game, oh, China will take Taiwan in 3 days, and here's these other problems, or millions of people will die and these ships will be sunk and all of that. Well, that's if you take the political calculations completely out of it, and it's like we're playing Battleship, the game where you fire, and it's like, so there's a political and diplomatic and economic calculus that is completely excluded from those war games.
But sometimes sending the message to the public is still very important. At least, most of people in Taiwan do not think there's a threat.
I think it's really important for an organization like US Taiwan Watch to elaborate, just like what Kharis said, like how should we interpret it and how should we see the results of the war game. And I found it a little bit probably pretty problematic, because when I see a lot of media reporting about especially the CSIS war game.
It's a prediction.
They take it like Doctor Strange, like different scenario, and this is what's going to be. And actually, this is not the way, like in design.
Right. Well, and let me highlight another weakness of war games. They really depend on the people who are recruited to play the different players. I've been in a couple of these, and the thing that's jumped out at me every time is the people who are assigned to this team, the red team or the blue team, they typically have some country knowledge or some operational knowledge, but they come with their own biases. They're not an expert on the elite politics of the CCP. And so the decision that player makes is made after a consultation of some people. If you switch those people out and put them on the other team, you might get a very different outcome. It's almost like a random draw from a universe. And in order to get a more accurate picture of the likely outcome of a game, you need to run it probably a couple hundred times, right? And organizations generally don't have the resources to do that over and over again. So think of this as, one outcome from a distribution, and it may be one that's an outlier on the high side or an outlier on the low side. And it's the outliers that people get most excited about, right? Wow, we beat off the Chinese in 3 days. All of their ships are sunk. Let's publish that, right? Where the typical outcome is somewhere in the middle, and those aren't as sexy.
And from your experience, have you been into the war games that with experts from Taiwan or military personnel from Taiwan?
It varies, but typically they pull on whoever is in this space who they can get in the room or virtually online. And often there aren't people who are from Taiwan or know Taiwan. And often the scenarios are quite abstract as well. Not all of the ones I'm talking about are the China invades Taiwan scenario. It may be something like blue country and green country. There's an island in between them. It's disputed. They both control half of it. They have this many resources, and there's no proper names attached to anything. And then they say, oh, this country has nuclear weapons, and you think that country has nuclear weapons. And so there's lots of different ways to set this up that may have relevance for Taiwan and its security, but that are not specifically designed to mimic or to recreate a Taiwan, to model a Taiwan scenario.
But can we say that because there are more and more war game information or getting public, is that means that more and more people are getting interested or getting more attention on the Taiwan Strait issues?
Yeah, I think that is true. I think there are more war games being done on the Taiwan contingency than there used to be. But these have been happening for 25, 30, 40 years probably. And
but in the past, there's no public ones.
Well, I mean, the Rand Corporation has done. I mean, they're the.
But recently, even the Congress.
I think that indicates some real interest and concern by political elites in these questions. They're not experts on the country. They're not experts in wargaming. They don't necessarily have expertise even in the kind of military balance questions. Generally, I think at best that's not all that useful, and at worst can be actively misleading to policymakers if they.
But for the positive side, we can still use this as a educational purpose, right?
You're very positive.
Okay.
Yeah. No, and I think but the piece here that I'm a little concerned about is that it gets publicized immediately. Like a day after the China committee goes through this war game, they're tweeting about it. And this many ships are sunk. Just be quiet, learn.
Yeah, if you want to be educational, then you have to come up with an article or something.
Do you think that's
longer.
a problem that now, because Taiwan issue is at the center in political conversations?
Yeah, especially about U.S.-China relations.
Yeah,
it's
so
the critical piece.
a lot of congressmen or congresswomen, they wanted to join this conversation. So what
You mean,
they
for
talked
example,
about,
some
like blowing up TSMC.
yeah, something like that.
Yeah, that was a terrible statement. And he walked it back afterwards. This is Seth Moulton, I think, right? And said, he was just throwing out a hypothetical. And I think he was on stage with Michelle Flournoy, who immediately called him out and said, that's a terrible idea. Why did you say that, right? So, I mean, the U.S. Congress is a big body. We've got 535 members, and they all have freedom of speech. They can say whatever they want, whenever they want. Much like Taiwan's Li Fa-yuan, one legislator saying something is not representing the position of Taiwan on that issue, right? And so you need to take that same mindset and use it when you're looking at the United States. If one member of Congress, one senator says X, that is not a representative view unless you hear it from 20 or 30 other members of the Senate. So it actually requires a bit more knowledge and an understanding of the nuances of U.S. politics to extrapolate or to infer information from individual senators or representatives'
That's our job.
comments.
Yeah.
Right? So on a personal note, I gave a quote to the Foreign Policy magazine, right? And I was stunned a couple days later when I was looking through the political debate shows in Taiwan. A couple of the people running a debate show put my picture up on front and said they didn't know who I was. They probably had some poor intern who saw my name on the article and had to Google me and pick the first picture they found.
Oh, Stanford University.
Yeah,
That was a very
Stanford,
good.
put that up. But then these guys just ran with it and said, well, number one, because he said this in this article implies that he wrote the article or he agrees with everything in the article, which is clearly false. I didn't give the article the title. I didn't write it. I just gave a quote. And then second, that I represent the position of the U.S. government. And how do you get to that point? I'm an independent scholar at a private university, right? I've never held a U.S. government position. I'm not a high-profile person. And so it was clear that they had a preconceived narrative that they wanted to push in that show, and I happened to be a convenient vehicle for them to move forward with. So,
I'm sorry. When I saw the clips, I actually was laughing.
it was hilarious too. Actually,
It's very common for Taiwanese.
Well, and to Taiwanese voters' credit, most of them understand that. I think the political talk shows, the people on those shows. It's a cheap way to get attention, right? And they're not in it to deliver the most accurate reporting to people or to inform people. They're there to create controversy because that attracts attention, right? So I think Taiwan's political debate shows, actually, I find them fascinating and really interesting. And in some ways, some of them are really quite admirable, I would say, because they have this norm that if you're going to have a slate of several different commentators, number one, they got to cover different political views, right? And so there's always somebody from the green camp, and there's always somebody from the blue camp on the ones that are really serious about providing a variety of views. So there's somebody from civil society, somebody who used to be in the government, from academia. So that's number one. Number two, they often get good gender balance.
That's true.
Look at Japan or Korea. I mean, there are other places in Asia.
You watch a lot.
I'm a political junkie. Sorry, this is my job. I love Taiwanese politics. Yeah, but the gender balance here is good. And then number three, the norm is each commentator gets a few uninterrupted minutes to speak. Like in the U.S., I can't think of a single program that has that model. And the Taiwan program model like that is superior, I think, because you at least hear from that person who's got a blue view, this person who has a green view, and three others who are all providing different perspectives. And it's not like the moderator is jumping in and shouting at them or saying, no, that's wrong. The best moderators are actually helping them along, providing them space to make their arguments. And so I think Taiwan already has a model that should be emulated, and by other countries as well. It's just that's not the only one. That's not even the modal pattern.
I think this
I have never thought
this
of
will
that
be my
way.
takeaway today. But I haven't thought about this.
I never thought about that. I never thought that Taiwan's
I have very negative
media
views on
program.
those programs.
Me too, right?
Me too. I never thought those commentator, can we call them like political commentator? It's actually from your view. It's a good.
Well, and so also. It's lively. It attracts
really
attention,
lively.
And that's a good thing because it forces people will pay attention. I'm astounded at the number of taxi drivers in Taiwan who know all about politics in Taiwan. If you ask a taxi driver in the U.S. or an Uber driver, they probably couldn't name who the governor of California is, right? So the level of political knowledge here, because of this constant daily thrumming of politics and debate, is actually pretty high.
Okay.
Thank you, Kharis. You're making me so positive about I feel so positive about our media program right now. Okay, let me...
Do you have any tough
Just
questions?
Let me move on to the last question. So let's go back to your trip here. So the reason why we know each other is because we are talking about like there's so many groups coming to Taiwan now. What do they want to know the most during this trip? And how can Taiwan better accommodate these groups?
The group I'm part of are already pretty knowledgeable about Taiwan, but they may not be familiar with who the current policymakers are. They may benefit from a deeper understanding of how those policymakers think about Taiwan's challenges. And so I expect a lot of our conversations will be about what are you worried about? What could you use from the United States? How can we strengthen our two governments and our two countries' relationships? In other cases, some of the delegations have very specific topics they want to talk about. So, security and defense is the big issue for a lot of these delegations. And we haven't mentioned Ukraine in this whole conversation yet, but the war in Ukraine is really shaping American perceptions of Taiwan's vulnerabilities as well. So the fact that there's a major power war, that there are people dying every day in that conflict, it's not just a hypothetical, has focused a lot of minds in the U.S. on what might be possible in the Taiwan Strait. There's also a sense that the U.S. and Europe failed to deter Putin's invasion of Ukraine, and that Taiwan is an order of magnitude at least more important to the United States, and we need to make sure we don't fail to deter an invasion from the PRC. And so many of the delegations that come to Taiwan start from that mindset. They're like, we're looking at Ukraine, we see the problems that Ukraine faces, we want to ensure that Taiwan is in a better position than Ukraine was. How do we get there? And that's a very different conversation even from 3 years ago, before the war in Ukraine. In some cases, delegations are coming because it's the hot ticket. Taiwan is, front and center in U.S.-China relations, and they either want to signal publicly their support for Taiwan as a way to show that they're standing up to big bad China across the strait, or maybe signal something else to a domestic audience. They're an anti-communist fighter, or that they love freedom, and in some senses they may be effectively using Taiwan as a stage to make a case that's entirely focused back home. So there's a variety of reasons, and I think the ones where people are coming to try to understand Taiwan better are much more helpful for both sides than the latter.
The members of your groups actually hopefully will be the Taiwan expert in next generation.
Yeah, well, that's the goal of the program, is to try to cultivate their expertise, and especially to people in doctoral programs are often focused on methodology or publishing, and they're speaking to an audience of 3, their committee, right? And so it's actually a difficult transition sometimes from the role of a researcher and scholar to one of a public analyst or intellectual. And being able to speak in front of cameras, to be able to use language that a non-expert in your field can understand and appreciate, that's not a skill that gets developed in graduate school very much. And so you have to practice it a little bit.
Actually, that contradicts to our career in the academia. Because the whole system does not encourage us to do this.
Yes, very much. In fact, some faculty members see this as an unhelpful distraction from what you should be doing, which is research and publishing, right?
Really? They think it that way?
Oh, yes. The way to get tenure is to publish in good journals, and nothing else matters.
Because that is the only one credit we get from the whole system.
Right. And so there are some faculty members who, once they get tenure, will transition to that public intellectual role because they don't have the same pressure. But others, many actually, get conditioned to think that their audience should be the scholarly community, and that any work that's done for a wider audience is wasted. You can do that maybe in your free time, but you're not benefiting your own career or the development of knowledge.
Yeah, my free time is just to sacrifice some sleeping time.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I think that is actually a really huge challenge now for Taiwan. We're seeing a huge opportunity right now as the global attention is focusing on Taiwan, and so many groups and delegation is coming to Taiwan. But at the same time, it's a challenge for us to how to accommodate and to really reach out to every single person that is really interested in Taiwan and to fill the gap, the expert gaps you mentioned earlier. Yeah, so I think it's also our jobs for U.S. Taiwan Watch and also for Kharis at the U.S. side to help us to bridge between U.S. and Taiwan and allowing those experts to really cultivate their expertise.
Yeah, well, let me say something else in response to that. The Taiwan government is used to hosting these sorts of delegations. MOFA is pretty good at creating an itinerary, shepherding people around, feeding them very well, showing them a good time, and getting the face time with the people they want to meet. But in my experience, the most interesting and sometimes the most informative meetings I have are with people who are not in the government sector at all. So people who are in civil society. The Taiwan government will certainly not oppose those sorts of meetings. They're willing to put them on the agenda, but they're not necessarily something that's prioritized. And frankly, on the U.S. side, I think the people who have a stronger incentive to invest in the relationship for the long run are people who are younger, who are not as high profile, who aren't in really senior positions of responsibility, and who may be there in 20 years, but now at this point in their careers have more time and energy to focus on Taiwan for more than a week, and so there's actually room for this space to be much broader and include many more people than it does now.
I really look forward to the future U.S.-Taiwan relations, and I'm very positive. Both of us, U.S.-Taiwan Watch and Hoover Institution, we have a lot of work to do. Yeah.
It's a good problem to have. I'm glad people care about Taiwan,
sure.
And I'm glad there's attention on it. So.
Yeah. So thank you, Kharis, for this interview, for the really long interview.
Yeah.
And hope you had a great time in Taiwan.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to have the opportunity to chat with you both.